The World War II Memorial honors the sacrifice and determination of a nation and a generation during the middle part of the 20th century. Located along the ceremonial entrance, one finds 24 bronze bas-reliefs created by sculptor Ray Kalski. His work depicts both the home front and the battle scenes, highlighting that sacrifice and determination. The following reliefs appear along the north side of the ceremonial entrance and illustrate images associated with the Atlantic theater of the war, beginning with the plaque nearest the Washington Monument. Lend-Lease. Prior to the United States' entry into the war with Japan and Germany, many of its future allies, including Great Britain, Russia, and China, desperately needed assistance. Instituting the Lend-Lease policy, President Franklin Roosevelt agreed to lease ships, tanks, jeeps, and food, with Allied payment to follow after the war. Bond drive. On the home front during the war, Americans both young and old offered assistance to friends and family members fighting overseas. They raised victory gardens and held scrap drives. In order to raise money for the war effort, Americans participated in rallies and parades encouraging the sale of war bonds. Women in military. Prior to the war, women could only serve the military in nursing and clerical positions. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, however, the military allowed women to serve as pilots and in other new non-combatant roles. Newly established units included the Women Accepted for Voluntary Emergency Service, Women's Air Force Service Pilots, Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, and several reserve units. Rosie the Riveter, aircraft construction. Due to a severe manpower shortage, factories increasingly employed women whose pre-war roles kept them at home. These women helped build the aircraft, ships, and tanks vital to the war effort. Nicknamed Rosie the Riveter, she substantially increased production of war material to unheard-of levels. Battle of the Atlantic. To hamper the transport of our industrial might across the Atlantic, the German Navy effectively utilized its U-boat submarine force. Operating in groups called wolf packs, U-boats sank over 2,500 Allied ships by war end. The implementation of the convoy system and the breaking of German codes substantially aided the Allied victory in the Atlantic. Air War B-17. During the Second World War, aircraft became a vital instrument of warfare. Allied bombers, protected by fighter escort, destroyed enemy factories and infrastructure, including railroads and bridges. Sadly, enemy fighter planes, along with anti-aircraft fire called flak, devastated thousands of air crews. The B-17 Flying Fortress fought alongside many other famous planes, including the P-51 Mustang. Paratroopers. Fighter, bomber, and transport aircraft each became a necessity to the Allied war effort. Transport aircraft introduced a new method of delivering troops to the front line. They dropped highly skilled airborne troops, called paratroopers, behind enemy lines at places such as Sicily, Normandy, Holland, and Germany. Normandy beach landing. After nearly 2 years of attacking German-held positions in France with bomber aircraft, the Allies launched the D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944. The joint operation, codenamed Overlord, landed Allied troops on the northern shores of France. Landing craft successfully delivered troops to Normandy shores, heavily laden with beach obstacles and exposed to German fire. Tanks in combat. Following the invasion of Normandy, Allied and American troops launched Operation Cobra, breaking through German defenses. Tanks aided the infantrymen in the field and played an integral part in the breakout into France. The American M4 Sherman, inferior to many German tanks in armor and armament, proved to be highly successful due to its large production numbers. Medics in field. During the American Civil War, minor battlefield wounds often proved fatal. By the Second World War, the survival rate of combat wounded improved dramatically due to advances in medicine and the use of Army medics and Navy corpsmen. Medics and corpsmen often treated wounded under fire in the field, making them some of the bravest on the battlefield. Battle of the Bulge. By mid-December 1944, the Allies, standing on the doorstep of Germany, believed that Hitler's army had all but lost. That belief changed when Hitler launched a massive offensive into Belgium, breaking the Allied line, creating a large bulge. Dogged resistance by American units surrounded at key crossroad towns, along with German fuel shortages, brought about the demise of Hitler's December offensive. Russians meet Americans at the Elbe. Following the Battle of the Bulge and a winter of hard fighting, the Allies plowed into Germany on all sides. On April 25, 1945, American and Russian armies finally met at the Elbe River. American troops there discovered how hard the war had been for the Russians, finding women fighting in combat alongside men. The Allied victory over Germany arrived 12 days later with its unconditional surrender. The following reliefs appear along the south side of the ceremonial entrance and illustrate images associated with the Pacific theater of the war, beginning with the plaque nearest the Washington Monument. Pearl Harbor. December 7, 1941, became a day that thrust the United States into a war that had been raging across the globe for nearly a decade. The United States offered its allies limited help until that point, through the Lend-Lease program. The Japanese attack against the U.S. Navy's Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor shocked and enraged the nation, prompting a congressional declaration of war. Enlistment. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, vast numbers of Americans, anxious to defend their country, enlisted in the armed forces. Despite high volunteer rates, the draft, initiated on October 16, 1940, became the military's answer for manpower shortages. Men and women became members of the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and Merchant Marines. Embarkation. Millions of Americans joined the military services at the onset of World War II. After extensive training at home, these brave men and women boarded ships, embarking on their crusade against tyranny and oppression. Luxury liners, such as the RMS Queen Mary, served as cramped transport vessels taking our troops over there. Shipbuilding. In order to assist our allies, President Franklin Roosevelt established a policy of lending them war materiel. To transport that materiel overseas, American shipyards boosted production dramatically to meet the demand. Ship construction was not limited to transport vessels, however. Following the devastating attack at Pearl Harbor and throughout the war, warships became equally important. Agriculture. War raged across the globe, creating desperate agricultural needs. U.S. allies receiving aid through the Lend-Lease program found food and other agricultural products equally as important as war materiel. In order to meet global needs, American farms, recovering from the Depression, became the breadbasket for the world. Submarine Warfare. The United States Navy had a difficult time recovering from Pearl Harbor. Battleships, the rulers of the sea, had been decimated, forcing aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines to take the lead. Submarines became extremely effective in targeting enemy shipping. These underwater vessels proved cramped and uncomfortable for the brave sailors who manned them. Navy in action. The naval war in the Pacific evolved dramatically during the early months of the war. Battleships that previously dominated the sea took a back seat to the aircraft carrier. Carriers had the ability to deliver massive amounts of firepower at great distances. This new style of naval warfare played a dramatic role in the success of the United States strategy of hopping from one island to another. Amphibious Landing. The United States, in order to liberate Japanese-occupied territory throughout the Pacific and bring an end to the war, adopted a new strategy of fighting. Island hopping entailed amphibious landings that deposited the troops and equipment required to capture the islands and the creation of air bases. Once secured, the island became a staging ground for the next series of attacks moving closer to Japan. Jungle warfare. After the troops landed on the beaches, they found themselves fighting in the middle of dense jungles. Jungle warfare proved to be a miserable experience for most of the veterans that endured it. The hot, humid climate and disease-carrying insects combined with a well-fortified enemy to make fighting in the jungles less than enjoyable. Field burial. Thousands of American soldiers died fighting in the jungles of the Pacific Theater. Logistically, it was impossible to immediately return fallen heroes to their families back home. Field burials became necessary in order to deal with the rising number of combat dead. The upturned M1 Girard rifle, with helmet placed on top, served as the temporary tombstone for many troops. Liberation. Throughout the course of the war, thousands of U.S. servicemen and women were taken prisoner. Whether they were shot down pilots from aircraft carriers, rescued sailors from torpedoed ships, or captured soldiers from Bataan, they found themselves confined in Japanese prison camps. Liberation came late in the war for many of these malnourished, poorly treated Americans. VJ Day. After more than 4 miserable years of hard fighting against a determined foe, word of a Japanese surrender arrived in the Pacific on August 14, 1945. Aboard the USS Missouri, on September 2, 1945, Japanese government representatives signed documents officially ending the war. Each day, important in U.S. and world history, became dates of great celebration known as Victory Japan Day or VJ Day. The following reliefs appear along the south side of the ceremonial entrance and illustrate images associated with the Pacific theater of the war, beginning with the plaque nearest the Washington Monument.